If you're looking for a roomy, family-friendly two-row crossover that won't break the bank, the Santa Fe should absolutely be at the top of your shopping list. This is significantly larger on the inside than a RAV4 or CR-V, but unusual for a mid-sized two-row crossover, the price tag is not significantly larger. The base model of Santa Fe will start less than $1,000 more than the base Toyota RAV4. And to be perfectly honest, there aren't very many compromises for choosing the bigger Santa Fe over some of those smaller compact crossovers. In this video, I'm going to talk about the base 2.5-liter engine. That's the one I was able to get my hands on today. And obviously the XRT trim, which is the new, more rugged styled, but not necessarily more rugged Santa Fe. Another reason I like the Santa Fe is that it comes in so many different forms. Do you want a hybrid? There's one of those. Do you want a plug-in hybrid? There's one of those also. And if you'd rather have more of a performance-oriented model with a 2.5-liter turbo engine, there's one of those also. The hybrid model is the next step up in the lineup from the base engine. That's going to set you back $33,900. Not too far off where we see some hybrids in the compact crossover segment, but certainly more than the RAV4 hybrid. The 2.5-liter turbo, that's $39,110 for 2022, and the plug-in hybrid, that's an interesting twist because at $39,005, it's actually notably less than a RAV4 plug-in hybrid. But today, by popular request, we're taking a look at the model with the base engine. Now, this is the new, slightly more rugged off-road trim, so you can see we do have some blacked out accents up front, some extra body cladding here and there, slightly different wheels, and a roof rack on top. Notably absent on this model, however, is any actual improvement in off-road ability. This is just a styling and appearance package, so it's a little bit different than the Wilderness line over at Subaru. 2021 brought us a new look to the front end, but it's been a little bit difficult actually to get Santa Fe's in for test, so this is only the second time I have seen this model with the new front bumper. And I like the grille design here. Let me know what you think about the look down there in the comment section. The headlights are still divorced from these accent strips up top, but they are closer together, and I think this design is more harmonious than the first few times that Hyundai has tried to separate these elements. We do have LED headlights here, and then this T-shaped accent strip inside. No fog lights down at the bottom. Normally when we talk about a bigger vehicle being about the same price as a smaller alternative, you have to give up features and functions in order to get the extra size. But that's what's so odd about the Santa Fe. That's not the case here. In fact, you'll actually find a few more active safety systems standard on the Santa Fe than you find in some compact crossovers. For instance, smart cruise control, blind spot monitoring, lane keeping assistance, emergency, autonomous braking, including pedestrian, cyclist, and junction assistant. Wow, that's a mouthful. All of those are standard on even the base version of the Santa Fe. Now, you should know that if you're taking a look at a 2021 model, which might still be hanging out on a dealer lot, they're going to miss some of those features, but all the 2022s will have that entire package on them standard. At 188.4 inches long, the Santa Fe is on the short side for the mid-size segment, but significantly longer than the average compact crossover. This is 7 inches longer than a Toyota RAV4, and almost all of that goes to legroom. This has 7 inches of combined legroom more than we find in that Toyota. Now, the big reason that size-wise this is smaller than something like a Jeep Grand Cherokee has entirely to do with that hood. This was designed as a front-wheel drive based vehicle, so it doesn't have that long hood profile that we find in the Grand Cherokee, and that's why, even though this is shorter on the outside, it's roomier on the inside. Moving to the back, we have a single exhaust tip on the passenger side. Turn signals are separate from the tail lamp modules. That's kind of an interesting twist. And then we have large red bars that go from one side to the other, but they're not illuminated, as you can see. They're just reflectors here and reflectors up top as well. The XRT package is pretty distinctive. In addition to the chrome delete up front, we have the black wheels that you saw there when we were taking a look at the side. Interesting twist, we still have the chrome surround on the windows there, but we also have the roof rails, which I think could be an important factor for some folks that are looking for a slightly more outdoorsy, slightly more adventurous Santa Fe. We then also have these small running boards here right down there at the bottom, and tweaked trim here and there all the way around the vehicle. You can see when you open the door, you can actually see the rest of that running board. But the Santa Fe isn't terribly high off the ground, so I didn't find it really too useful to have those running boards. The Santa Fe has proved popular enough in North America that we're going to get 4 different drivetrains, but none of them is like what we find in the average midsize crossover. Something like a Chevy Blazer or a Jeep Grand Cherokee, those start with naturally aspirated V6 engines, and under here you will never find a naturally aspirated V6 in North America. Instead, things start out with an engine more similar to the average compact crossover. This engine, the one that I'm driving today, is a base 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine producing 191 horsepower and 181 pound-feet of torque. Those in the know will notice that this is actually a little bit less power than we find, for instance, in a base RAV4. Fuel economy comes in at 26 mpg if you choose front-wheel drive, 24 mpg if you choose all-wheel drive. Now, if you're interested in more power more similar to the average midsize crossover, don't worry, there is a 2.5-liter turbo available that bumps things up to 281 horsepower and a whopping 311 pound-feet of torque. It also gets an 8-speed dual-clutch transmission, which is somewhat unusual for a mainstream vehicle. Fuel economy, thanks to that dual-clutch transmission, doesn't actually drop if you choose the all-wheel drive model. It still comes in at 24 mpg. Then there are two different hybrid systems, a regular hybrid and a plug-in hybrid. They're both based around a 1.6-liter turbo, however. The turbo engine produces 178 horsepower on its own, and that bumps up to 226 horsepower for the regular hybrid, 261 horsepower for the plug-in hybrid. The regular hybrid gets you 32 mpg. It is a little bit below the Toyota Venza, but the Venza is oddly enough not a mid-size crossover. It really is still a compact crossover, and this has significantly more room on the inside. Then there's that plug-in hybrid system. That's 261 horsepower thanks to a more powerful electric motor that will get you 33 mpg and 30 miles of electric range. Over a week of driving, I found this front seat to be pretty comfortable. The MSRP on this model is $34,000 before destination, so right in line with a lot of compact crossovers. And like most compact crossovers, we have just a two-way adjustable lumbar support, manual tilt telescopic steering column. Now, you will find a more comfortable and a more adjustable seat in the top-end trims of Santa Fe, and that makes sense because that version is the one that's competing more directly with the Blazer, the Edge, the Grand Cherokee, etc. Move to the back seat and it's instantly obvious what I mean about family friendliness. In a Toyota RAV4, I could not have the front seat comfortably adjusted for me as a driver at 6 feet tall and put a rear-facing child seat behind me. In this vehicle, there is a ton of room, and this seat is not even latched into place, but it is at the correct angle. You can see I have about 2 inches of room between this seat and the driver's seat, and if I were to actually latch this into place, it would end up moving about an inch further rearward. So this is the kind of vehicle where you can very easily have adults, especially taller adults up front, and still have rear-facing child seats or front-facing child seats comfortably behind. The rear bench is also a little bit wider than the average compact crossover, meaning that putting 3 adults back here is going to be more comfortable, 3 kids, 3 booster seats, whatever you want to combine back here in the rear. If I scoot over to the right side of the vehicle, this front seat's all the way back in its tracks. It's worth noting that these tracks also move further rearward than the average compact crossover, and I still have about 2.5 inches of legroom left. If you're a taller driver or you frequently have taller passengers up front, the Santa Fe is certainly going to be roomier than average. The front seat tracks move further rearward than we find in the average compact crossover, and also most mid-size crossovers or SUVs as well. It's really obvious when I move over here to the right side. This front seat is quite far away from the dashboard, and even so, I still have about 2.5 inches of legroom left. The rear bench seats also recline. This is actually a pretty aggressive recline mechanism. It moves about 6 inches or so, and even though we have a hump down here in the middle for the rear passengers, it is quite small. It's only about an inch tall. One thing I noticed in this Santa Fe is that it does not have the sliding second row seats that have been a hallmark of the Santa Fe for a while. In the 2020 model year vehicle, the second row seats could slide forward and backwards. That way you still had a lot of legroom, but you could put even more cargo in the back. I'm sad that that feature appears to be missing, but we still have a large and accommodating cargo area, 36.4 cubic feet back here, and based on the size, I suspect they're not including the underfloor storage area, because I was able to fit the same number of roller bags back here that I was in the RAV4, and this cargo area is theoretically a little bit smaller. And there's also a trick up its sleeve. Hyundai locates the spare tire under the vehicle, and then above that we get a ton of additional storage space, most notably this compartment right here. We have a trifold lid. I can pull that off so you can see what that cargo divider looks like. This cargo divider is so large and so deep that if I pull it out of the vehicle, right like that, you can actually fit 2 24-inch roller bags in this well right here and then still stick 6 bags on top. The only bummer with that arrangement is that there is this small cargo area right in front of it where we find the jack and a little bit of extra storage, and it is in front of rather than behind this deep cargo well. The reason this cargo well is here most likely is because the Santa Fe and the Kia Sorento are somewhat closely related, and the Sorento is a 3-row vehicle. Another practical touch is that the foam divider is not required to support the load floor back here. It will support itself if you want to use it without the cargo divider, or you could leave the cargo divider and the load floor off and just have access to this deep storage well. The only problem, of course, is that this storage compartment in front of it is in the way, and it's about 18 inches deep or so. So anything going into this large, deep storage well, you are going to have to lift over this area. There is a little bit of storage under there, and of course, there's the jack as well. If you're wondering where the plug-in hybrid's battery pack is located, wonder no longer. Yep, it is right back here in this area. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the XRT trim, so we don't have things like a moonroof, which you will find in the upper level trims. Thankfully, the sun visors still slide, the shoulder belts for the driver and front passengers adjust for height, and then we have two-way adjustable headrests. As you can see, the rear doors have well-integrated sunshades. The upholstery is a little bit different in the XRT trim. You can see that it has kind of a unique pattern right there in the middle. I do prefer the leather options that are available in the Santa Fe, but you are going to pay a little bit more for some of those leather options than the average compact crossover. Moving down, you'll notice that we don't have a lot of aggressive bolstering here, so larger folks shouldn't have any problem here. And these seats are just a hair wider than the average compact crossover, as is the center console, which we'll take a look at in a bit. So if you are looking for something that's a bit roomier, it's another reason you might want to take a look at this. The front doors have a reasonable number of soft touch materials, but keep the price point in mind. So we will find harder plastics in the center of the door there, soft touch plastics around the armrest, etc. There's a pretty decently sized bottle holder down at the bottom. The imitation knurled metal trim wraps from the doors on over to the dashboard, and the dashboard is somewhat symmetrical, so you can see that the style of the driver's side and the general shapes going on are pretty similar, the way that the dashboard ducks in right here. This is an injection molded upper portion of the dashboard. You will find hard plastics above that, and this is not real stitching. It is injection molded imitation stitching, but it's pretty well done. There's a small storage area where you can put smartphones, knickknacks, things like that. We then have a bin-style glove compartment that was able to accommodate an 11-inch tablet. In the middle of the dashboard, we find a color touchscreen infotainment system. There are two different ones on offer. This is the smaller of the two, and the smaller of the two is the one that supports wireless Apple CarPlay. There's no factory mapping interface, but personally I don't mind because I use CarPlay all the time. Two large air vents right there, engine start-stop button, and then tons of buttons in the center console. With the exception of a few touch buttons right there around that LCD, pretty much everything here is a button. Climate control toggles, climate control buttons, button and toggle for the drive modes right there. There's a lock button in the middle, around there for the drive modes. We then have push buttons for the shifter, auto brake hold, engine start, stop, etc. These little button blanks constantly remind you that you did not pay extra for the ventilated seats. Below that we find a little storage area there. We have a single cup holder, USB input if you want to use it, and the Qi Wireless charging mat status light. The Qi Wireless charging mat is actually right over here in this area. There's a little slot right there. One cup holder that is always visible. That one is close-offable. We then have a pretty decently sized center console storage area. On the driver's side, we find a full LCD instrument cluster. There are 4 different themes for this cluster. You can see them cycling through right there. You can also link them to the drive mode if you're so inclined. This is the one that I find most unusual, and it's one that we find in other Hyundai vehicles with the little cubes right there. Aside from swapping the theme around and taking a look at where the power for the all-wheel drive system is going, the system is not as configurable as some, most notably some Volkswagen LCD instrument clusters. The steering wheel is a round 3-spoke design with sort of a split bottom spoke right there, sport grips up top, paddle shifters on the back, controls for the infotainment system over here on the left, and the adaptive cruise control system on the right. If you're interested in swift 0 to 60 times, you're going to want the 2.5-liter turbo model. That should go 0 to 60 in about 6 seconds. The hybrid, about 7.8. If you don't get the hybrid, this 2.5-liter model is the slowest. This is 8.1 seconds 0 to 60. So this is certainly slower than the base RAV4 or Honda CR-V, but it is a little bit faster than a Nissan Rogue. And that's the big reason that the price tag of the base model is lower than a Ford Edge, or insert your mainstream mid-size crossover here, because we get a much less powerful engine. Again, very similar to the average compact crossover. But because we get relatively wide tires on this vehicle, 235 width tires all the way around, the stopping distance is surprisingly short, just 112 feet. That is definitely shorter than the average compact crossover. And the nature of this vehicle is somewhere between worlds. It's not the peppiest. Floor it and, we get some acceleration eventually here out of this engine. Again, if you want more, there's a different engine available. But aside from that, the handling is sharp, but the suspension tune is towards the softer side of things. It feels sort of like a grown-up crossover compared to a RAV4 or a CR-V. Those are going to feel a little bit more eager. This is a little bit more dulled down, a little bit more relaxed, but I don't necessarily find that to be a bad thing. I find this to be very comfortable, very quiet, relatively easy to live with. Thanks to an excellently tuned suspension, you can still have a ton of fun when the road starts to wind. Just keep in mind that if you really want the sportiest version, that's not going to be the one that I'm driving. Out on a gravel road like the one that I'm on here, the Santa Fe is certainly tuned towards the softer side of things as compared to the average compact crossover. So if you're looking for something that's more comfortable for longer highway journeys or more appropriate for living a little further off the beaten path like I do, the Santa Fe is going to be an excellent option. The suspension tune is not quite as supple as something like a Subaru Outback, but it's definitely more towards that direction than the suspension tune that we find in a RAV4 or a CR-V or Mazda CX-5. The ride quality certainly goes with that more grown-up feel that I mentioned earlier. As long as we're not talking about the engine noise coming into the cabin under full throttle acceleration, the cabin is pretty hushed. At 50 miles an hour, I measured 70 decibels in here, which definitely makes this quieter than the average compact crossover. But when you floor it, you're definitely going to hear that four-cylinder working hard. The engine sounds in this are a little bit more refined than in the RAV4, but this definitely has a compact crossover feel in that respect. Performance and fuel economy are the obvious compromises for getting a bigger vehicle with roughly the same amount of power under the hood as a smaller vehicle. I've been averaging 24.4 mpg this week, which is just a hair over the EPA estimate, but that's certainly below a lot of compact crossovers, including Hyundai's own Tucson. If you're interested in better fuel economy, of course, there is the hybrid model, and that will give you over 30 mpg. The big thing to know about the hybrid model is that it does have a true mechanical all-wheel drive system, so very unlike what we see in the RAV4, and that also applies to the plug-in hybrid version of the Santa Fe. If you're after a hybrid that will get you mid-30 mpgs if you treat it nicely and still have solid winter traction, that's a reason that you might want to get the Santa Fe hybrid or the Santa Fe plug-in hybrid. The plug-in hybrid, again, also has that same all-wheel drive system. And things are a little bit different in the RAV4, where it has an electric motor on the rear axle. It's certainly capable, but the feel is going to be quite different in snow and on ice. For this particular Santa Fe, the most direct competitor, however, would be the base Subaru Outback, because it also has a naturally aspirated four-cylinder engine, and performance is roughly similar to the Santa Fe that I'm driving here. In that comparison out on the road, I think I prefer the way that this feels. I'm not the biggest fan of the CVT that we find in the Outback, especially with the base engine. This certainly feels more engaging with the traditional 8-speed automatic transmission. The paddle shifters definitely have a more engaging feel to them with the real automatic. I can hear the engine just about as well in the Santa Fe and the Outback, but this engine is more refined than the one that we find in the Subaru. And even though the Subaru has a lower center of gravity, this suspension tune I think is a little bit more appropriate. It doesn't lean quite as much, it doesn't tip and dive quite as much. It's not going to be quite as soft as the Subaru suspension, so on longer road trips that might be a bit more comfortable, but I think for daily driving, this is the tune that I prefer. Now let's take a deep dive into pricing. The Santa Fe will set you back $27,400 for 2022. If you want all-wheel drive, it's going to be at least $29,150. That is more expensive than something like a Subaru Outback, but it's right in line with the RAV4 and the CR-V, two big players in the compact crossover segment, and significantly less expensive than the 2022 Chevy Blazer, which has dropped its base naturally aspirated engine, or a Ford Edge or a Jeep Grand Cherokee, Nissan Murano, etc. Over the years, Hyundai has continually increased the price of the Santa Fe, and it's no longer quite the smashing deal that it once was, but I still think it is pretty good value. The XRT trim that I was driving slots right in the middle of the lineup at about $32,450. But you should know that if you want all the features that you find on this model on a different trim without the XRT black touches here and there, you can get it for a little bit less expensive. You can go for the SEL with the convenience package on it, and it's about $1,600 less. For the extra $1,600 versus the SEL convenience trim, the only actual features you get are the roof rails and the side steps, features that honestly I could live without and save the extra $1,600. Unless, of course, you like the blacked out options. Now let's take a look at the first competitor, which is the Subaru Outback. The Outback is $26,945 starting, and it's also an odd entry in this segment because it's the only station wagon. Of course, Subaru has done a masterful marketing job convincing everybody that the Outback wagon, even though it is the wagon variant of the Legacy, is in fact a crossover, which I think is perfectly fine because I love me some station wagons and I love station wagon crossovers, so I think this is a win-win. There are obviously some pros and cons to the wagon format of the Outback, and you'll really notice that if you park it and the Santa Fe next to one another. I actually have a video comparing those two vehicles more directly. But the basics here are that the Outback is longer and lower, has a pretty decent ground clearance. The Santa Fe is more traditionally SUV shaped, so it's a little bit boxier, a little bit more upright. If you want to sit in a more upright fashion, then you want the Santa Fe. If you want more of a relaxed, more sedan-like driving position, then you want the Outback. If you're interested in a lower roofline, the Outback is going to give it to you. So if you're the kind of person that likes to put your bike on top of the roof or other things on top of the roof, and you don't want to have to get a stepladder to help get to those things, then you want the Outback. On the other hand, if you want an 8-speed automatic transmission, not a CVT, you're going to want the Santa Fe. Also, if you want a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid, you're not going to find those in Subaru's lineup at the moment. The value proposition for the Outback is extreme, but by the time you work your way up to the upper end trims of the Outback, then comparable features in the Santa Fe are going to be pretty comparably priced. You should also know that the Santa Fe has a longer standard powertrain warranty, something that I might be interested in if I were looking at either of these two vehicles. How does the Santa Fe compare to the most popular compact crossover in America, the Toyota RAV4? Let's take a look now. That starts at $26,525. So again, a little bit less than $1,000 more than the RAV4. But you get more features, and the more I dug into this, the more I was actually impressed with the price tag of the Santa Fe. The base RAV4 has 17-inch steel wheels. The base Santa Fe has 18-inch alloys. We get an 8-inch infotainment system in the Santa Fe, 7-inch infotainment system in the RAV4, but both do give you smartphone integration standard. Blind spot monitoring is something that you won't find on the base RAV4, but thanks to a recent tweak in the lineup, you will find on the new Santa Fe models. Also, the autonomous emergency braking program that is standard on both vehicles is more advanced on the Santa Fe. The big difference is that it includes junction turning assist. So if you're in an intersection and you're turning left across the traffic, the autonomous emergency braking program in the Santa Fe will be looking at the traffic coming across you and then will autonomously brake you if it thinks you're going to hit someone that is coming your way. Now, there are a few things you have to give up for those extra functions, however. You have to give up a little bit of power. Instead of 203 horsepower in the RAV4, we get 191 horsepower in the Santa Fe. And you will certainly notice that slower 0 to 60 time. Part of that is because we don't have as much power. The other part of that is because the Santa Fe is bigger and therefore weighs about 300 pounds more. If that's a problem for you, you could always get the hybrid version of the Santa Fe. That's going to be a little bit quicker. The plug-in hybrid is pretty similar in performance. Or you could get the 2.5-liter turbo model, which is certainly going to be swift. Next, let's take a look at Hyundai's own Tucson. Obviously, with the Santa Fe being so inexpensive, they had to make the Tucson even less expensive. So it starts at $25,500. It's a really good deal compared against the RAV4, actually. Even though both of these crossovers have a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine and essentially the same 8-speed automatic transmission, the engine in the Tucson makes a little bit less power. So even though it is lighter, you won't actually get better performance in that base model Tucson as a result. Interestingly, there are a number of options that are not quite aligned in these two vehicles when it comes to active safety. For instance, blind spot is optional in the Tucson, although it does get a bigger cargo area. We also have the more advanced autonomous emergency braking program standard in the Santa Fe. It's optional in the Tucson, as is adaptive cruise control. The bottom line here between these two vehicles is that the Santa Fe is more expensive, but I also think it's a pretty good deal. Now, one amazing thing, on the spec sheet, the Tucson has a larger cargo area than the Santa Fe. However, again, I suspect that the Santa Fe's cargo measurement numbers are actually incorrect. I don't think they're properly accounting for that cargo area under the load floor. If you use that cargo area under the load floor, you will definitely fit more standard-sized luggage in the Santa Fe than you will in the Tucson. Another reason to buy the Santa Fe over the Tucson or the RAV4 is going to be the width of the rear bench seat. It's certainly going to be more comfortable for adults, for children, or combinations of children in child seats and adults in the back. It's simply roomier. That's definitely the direction I would want to go in if I especially had kids in rear-facing child seats. Next up, we have the recently redesigned and returned to America Venza. The most important thing to know about the Venza is that it's really a luxury RAV4. It is not a shrunken Highlander. And the relationship in Hyundai's lineup between the Santa Fe and the larger Sorento in Kia's lineup, that's a lot more direct. You can definitely see that the Santa Fe is a wider vehicle, it's longer than the Tucson, etc. But when you take a look at the Venza, it really is, at its core, a reskinned RAV4. And that's why the sexier profile that we find in the Venza actually reduces interior room versus the RAV4. So if you're looking at the RAV4 versus the Venza, know that in order to get the nicer interior bits, and I do think the interior is more luxurious in the Venza, I think it's prettier, etc., you have to actually give up room. And that's not what we see when you step from Tucson up into Santa Fe. You're getting the nicer bits, especially if you take a look at the calligraphy trim, and you're getting more room. The Venza, it's a different deal. On the other hand, the Venza has fantastic fuel economy. and I have to say I find the look very attractive. I especially like the rear tail lamp design in the Venza and the fact that it's all LEDs where we typically find a combination lamp at a lot of vehicles at this price point. For me at least, the main problem with the Venza is the fact that generally speaking, the reason you want to upgrade from a RAV4 into a mid-size crossover, as Toyota is trying to call the Venza, is you want the extra room. You want the extra cargo room, you want the extra passenger room, you want the extra width in the cabin, or you want a more powerful engine. And oddly enough, none of those things actually applies to the Venza. It is a little bit smaller on the inside, you get the luxury touches, but you don't actually find any more power in that than you find in a RAV4 hybrid. So for me, if I were looking at these two vehicles, I would certainly get the Santa Fe, unless you really, really like the style and you didn't need the extra room. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Which Santa Fe would you get if you were shopping for one? I suspect I would probably get the hybrid model. I think it's a great balance in the middle of the lineup. The 2.5-liter turbo is a lot of fun, but 24 mpg is not the most exciting with the all-wheel drive trim, and you will get 30 plus mpg easily in the hybrid model. Unfortunately, the hybrid and plug-in hybrid models are not available in calligraphy trim. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section as well. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNauto so you can see what I'm driving this week, Instagram, Twitter, all those other social places, and I'll see everybody next week.